She stared out the window of her apartment at the street below. How many times had she thought about jumping? Over these many years, she'd lost count. Once or twice, she'd even stood on her balcony ledge and tried to convince herself to let go, to make it all end, to keep them away at last. She felt so alone, unable to make friends in fear that she would see one of them in a familiar face and lash out at them like some maniac. All she ever wanted was someone to understand her. But all she had was Dane. Even her parents were gone now. Her mother died in a car accident some years back, hit by a drunk driver. Both parents died that day, in a way. But Dane, as wonderful as he was her big brother. He just wasn't a replacement for a friend or a lover. She was just so alone. A pair of ghosts in her corner were the only company she really had anymore. Twins. Little girls that seemed somehow attached to her. She paid them no mind, or at least tried not to. And the more she tried to ignore them, the more she was aware of their unrelenting presence. She found herself wondering from time to time how so young a pair of children could die. She'd considered asking, but thought it would be rude. She laughed out loud then, wondering if it were even possible to be rude to a ghost. 6 years ago, she visited Danica Bathory in Shady Acres Asylum. There hadn't been a day yet that she had not thought of the poor woman and the conditions she was being forced to live in. The Darklings were still there, with Frankie. Always. Unrelenting and terrifying, every encounter meant a new sense of insecurity, fear, and loathing. Some visits meant new scars. She stood sipping her tea and losing herself in her own mind. It was the only place she had anymore where she could find peace. No one could bother her there. Not even them. It took her nearly 25 years to master the skill of simply daydreaming her life away. Though she now found it difficult not to reminisce about her childhood. What she'd missed out on because of her visitors, tenacious and persistent as they were. She missed all those things she never got to do. Waking up in the morning and wondering what was for breakfast, as opposed to staying up all night in terror and wondering if things that she saw staring back at her in the dark would still be there in the morning. She wondered what it was like to play outside, run track, play hopscotch, what it was like to kiss a boy, as opposed to whether or not the boy's face would melt into some kind of monster. How it would feel to step into the rain and not worry about a ghost following her. To talk to someone and not hear the whispers of some demon trying to manipulate her mind. Yes, she missed all those things she never got to do. And she wondered all the time why she was the one it happened to. Why was she the one with this absurd gift? She didn't want it. She hated every minute of it. Spokane, Washington, 24 years earlier. Frankie, sweetie, I just need you to help me here. What is it that you're hearing right now? Anderson asked in his most gentle tone. I don't want to talk about it, she screamed at the top of her lungs. Her little hands were clenched over her ears so tight that she thought her little eardrums might burst from the pressure. She was pacing around the room like some kind of terrified, caged mouse. Frankie, please sit down, honey. We need to get through this if we're going to make it all stop. You need to talk to me, please, Dr. Anderson said. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks, removing her hands from her ears slowly, her little eyes wide and bugging now, like she was terrified and frozen. She stood in silence, staring off into nothingness. Frankie? Dr. Anderson said with concern. Frankie did not respond. She simply stood there, stiff as a board, those pretty little eyes wide with terror. Anderson reached forward and placed a hand on her arm to comfort her, or try to get some sort of response from the catatonic child. But as soon as his fingertips touched her, he was thrown back by some unseen force, like it was a hand, clammy and cold and rickety, tossing him backward over his chair with the force of a championship prize fighter. He slammed into the curio cabinet on the other side of the room and shielded himself from the rain of glass that showered over him when it shattered. It took him a moment to gain his bearings, but when he finally looked back at Frankie, she still stood there. Her nose and eyes were dripping with blood, but she remained perfectly still. What the hell just happened? Or was her mind so convinced of it that when she told him these stories, he was beginning to suffer the delusion as well? He stood slowly and started to walk toward her, the sound of glass crunching beneath his feet. He approached her cautiously and eased his hand in again to touch the poor child's shoulder. This time he was able. And as soon as his hand made contact, the child collapsed and began to sob. Tears and blood soaked her cheeks, and as Anderson lowered her to his lap and began to wipe her face with his kerchief. It's all right, kiddo. It's all over now. It's all gonna be okay, he said, doing all he could to comfort the child, while he himself remained frightened and confused. He looked at his wrists. The faint beginnings of bruises were already forming there. Imprints of alien-like fingers, the like of which he had only seen in the thin and elderly population. He looked down at Frankie, the poor child riddled with fear, shaking like a leaf and sobbing. When the sobbing ceased so suddenly, Dr. Anderson showed concern, fearful that it would happen again. Instead, she just looked up at him, her brown eyes flooding with an ink-like blackness, and she spoke then, but it wasn't in her voice. Not the voice of a child, but more like that of some demon. Reality slapped her in the face with a knock at the door. Nearly dropping her cup of tea, she tried to catch her breath. "Who is it?" she shouted. No answer. She hated that. It was probably Mormons again, trying to spread the word of God, or maybe the Girl Scouts peddling cookies and pamphlets, which she refused so many times She lost count. "Hello? Who's there?" she shouted again. Finally, she gave up her perch and went to the door. And when she flung it open, no one was there. She scanned the hallway up and down, but not a whisper of any presence was there. She sighed and slammed the door. She needed some clearer answers. Someone who would really know what was happening to her. She had to go back to see Redamona. She was choiceless now. The driveway was packed with city personnel, vehicles, ambulance, police, coroner. This couldn't be happening. What the hell was going on? She ripped through the line of yellow tape barricading any unwanted visitors outside and shoved her way through the sea of blue suits and ties. Gold badges and tiny flip notebooks with matching pens flooded the once peaceful home of Redamona Pruitt. So far, she wasn't to be found. Andrew stood sobbing in the corner of the dining room. Frankie seemed to go unnoticed. She ran as quickly as she could to him and grabbed his arm, startling him. He looked at her almost damningly. "Andrew, what's going on? Where is Redamona?" Frankie asked near panic. "She's..." Andrew trailed off. "Answer me, Andrew, please." He looked at her with red, puffy eyes, like a wounded dog with no owner to crawl back to. "Andrew, please!" She grabbed his shoulders and shook him violently. He sobbed harder then. She's gone. She's gone. Already gone." He choked out between sobs. "Andrew," Frankie whispered. "What happened to her?" He looked at her in fear, almost unknowing of what he should say or how he should say it. She said too much. She wanted to call you, to tell you what to do. Andrew spoke softly. "Tell me what, Andrew? Talk to me, please," Frankie begged. "She couldn't take it anymore," he said. "Living with those things all the time, she couldn't take it anymore." He began to sob uncontrollably. "My sweet Reddy, I love you." It was the last time she would hear him speak. Andrew was a broken man now without his sweet Redamona. All he could do now was cry. She was his life, and Frankie knew that from the moment she met Andrew. What would become of him now? "Excuse me, ma'am, you shouldn't be here." A deep voice boomed behind her. When she turned, a large man in a black police uniform stood there, with his hand gently on her elbow, kindly urging her to leave. I knew her. She was my friend," Frankie said. "Then you must be Frankie Welch?" the officer asked. Yes, I am. Why do you ask?" Frankie replied, confused. "I'm Officer Moore. Please come with me, Miss Welch. We have to talk," the officer said as he guided her from Andrew to the porch outside. "What's going on? What happened to her?" she insisted. The officer took his hand from her elbow and looked at her for a moment. "How well did you know Redamona Pruitt, Miss Welch?" he asked her. Not very. We only met about..." I mean, we only met once about 6 years ago. We talked for a few hours about some common interests, and I left," she told him hesitantly. He squinted and slung a gloved finger across the bridge of his nose before speaking. "She left this," he said, pulling a crisp, pearl-colored envelope from his jacket pocket. "It's addressed to you," he said before handing it to her. Frankie was confused. "Shouldn't you keep this for evidence or something? Try to figure out what happened to her?" she asked. He looked at her, almost with a mixed expression of sadness and disgust. "We don't need an investigation, Miss Welch," he said quietly, looking now at his feet. He looked back up at her, squinting at the mid-morning sun. Her nephew found her this morning in the bathtub. She had chewed through her own wrists and bled to death last night. He gave her a pitiful look and squeezed her shoulder. "I'm sorry, but for now, whatever reason you came, it's best to just go back home until we're done here, and then in a few days come back and see Andrew. Maybe make sure he's all right." He paused for a moment then. "She was pretty much all the guy had left in the world." The officer nodded and walked away. Frankie clutched the envelope to her chest and stood there with a horrified expression painted on her face. Mona killing herself? There had to be some other explanation. Mona hardly seemed the type to commit suicide. She was a very proud, cheeky, and imperious woman. Chewing open her wrists? She could hardly believe it. No, she wouldn't believe it. It simply wouldn't have happened. But how did it happen then? Who or what killed Mona Pruitt? Certainly not Andrew. He simply loved and adored her too much to ever bring harm to her. Oh, and Miss Welch. The officer turned back, after having taken only a few short steps. He removed his cap and scratched his head before continuing. "Miss Pruitt had no eyes," he began. He heaved a confused sigh. "And Andrew said he didn't write the letter. We even compared handwriting samples already, just to be sure." He stopped and scratched his head again. "She had no eyes, Miss Welch." How did she write the letter?" It wasn't a question he expected any answer to. He handed her a card, sighed heavily. "Please call me if you need anything." He placed his cap back on his balding head and walked away, his expression one of deep pondering. Frankie looked down at the envelope clutched in her hands and furrowed her brow. Something evil was happening here. What could she do now? She sat there on the edge of her mattress, staring down at the wrinkles in the comforter now adorning the floor she woke up on. She had been blankly staring like that for at least an hour now. She hadn't even made coffee. Was all of this really happening? Was Mona Pruitt really dead? Or was it somehow because of her? She didn't want to think about it, but at the same time she couldn't stop. She hadn't even read the letter that Mona left for her. She wasn't even sure she ever would. The pair of young twins stood staring at her from the far corner of her apartment. They'd been there on and off for upwards of 3 months, just staring at her. And the more she ignored them, the more tenacious they became with their presence. Frankie was yet unsure of how to even acknowledge them. They were the first ghosts to ever have hung around for more than a few startling seconds. And what startled her more than that was that she was becoming used to them being there. But they just stared at her. 2 young girls no more than 8 or 9 years old with light brown hair and greenish blue eyes. They wore a light blue dress with a bow around the waist and a blue ribbon around their loose hanging hair. Little black slippers on their tiny feet with frilly socks to accent the dress. Both had their hands folded neatly in front of them and a look of pure question on their powder white little faces. Frankie sighed heavily and rubbed her hands down at her face. "Okay, I give up. What do you want? Why are you here?" she said aloud, looking to the far corner where the girls stood staring at her. They merely cocked their heads to the side slowly, as though they weren't quite sure if she spoke to them or not. So she said it again. "What do you want from me?" she repeated. They did nothing. Their heads stayed cocked to the side, and they remained there, staring silently at her. She growled out loud at the frustrating quiet and stood abruptly, making a beeline for her coffee pot. All she had to do was flip a switch, and the smell of fresh brewing coffee filled her nostrils. She loved that smell. She looked again at the tiny visitors standing in her corner and thought for a moment. It shouldn't be too hard, she thought, to get information on twin deaths. Her computer was, after all, her best friend in the world. She rolled her eyes then, sad to have been admitting that to herself. After a few minutes had passed, she poured herself a cup of coffee, added her usual mocha mix, and made her way to her laptop, sitting down on a pillow and taking a sip before turning it on. Immediately, she double-clicked the internet icon and waited for the page to load. She typed twin deaths in her search engine and was astounded at the mass of results she found there. 12,144,349 results found for twin deaths. She wanted to throw it across the room. She sighed heavily and looked across the room to her waiting and uninvited guests. Their heads still cocked to the side, they stood there, just staring at her. She took another sip of coffee. "Fine," she said, and returned her attention to her laptop screen. One by one, she checked the results of her search, finding nothing to match the girls haunting her apartment. 6 cups of coffee, 2 bathroom breaks, and 312 results later, she found something. Search for missing girls called off. Police have no new leads. The search for missing twins Heather and Marian Ingram, age 8, is called off after 60 days of intensive searching. Spokane police say they are baffled and exhausted, but if the girls haven't been found by now, we're afraid they never will be. The girls are presumed dead, and a memorial service will be held Monday, March 12, 1998. Police encourage anyone with information about the missing girls to still come forward. Frankie looked up and saw the 2 girls still standing there. But they had a new look on their faces now. almost a blank sense of urgency, as though her silent little friends were encouraging her to keep going, keep searching. She typed the names Heather and Mary Ann Ingram into her search engine. Far fewer results, but exactly the ones she was looking for. The first result yielded the information she needed. There was even a picture of the girls there wearing the same blue dress, the same hair, even the same little shoes. "There you are," she whispered. "Missing girls assumed dead. The search continues for twins Mary Ann and Heather Ingram, missing since Tuesday night. Parents Heather and Brendan Ingram say we had tucked the girls in after their bath at 9 o'clock. When we went back to check on them at 11, they were gone. Police say the windows in the girls' room were painted closed, and no intruders could have come into the house without Heather and Brendan's knowledge. Parents say that nothing in the girls' room was out of place or out of the ordinary, and there is no explanation for their disappearance. Heather and Brendan Ingram are still being held for questioning now, 7 days into the search." Frankie was confounded. Had the parents killed the girls? She looked again to the corner across the room. But this time the girls weren't still. It was like a tape being played in reverse, but skipping frames. The movements were quick and jerky, and the girls seemed to be frightened now. Frankie was becoming frightened as well. But this time, she was scared of what it was she was seeing. It went on for a few seconds like that, like they were struggling in reverse to free themselves of something, until the girls became suddenly frozen and vanished into thin air. Like puffs of smoke, they were gone. And as they vanished, she could hear tiny voices, frightened and desperate. "It's coming for you." Frankie was frozen. She took in a deep breath and looked back to her computer screen at the image there of the two young girls. They were haunting her for a reason, and if she wanted to get rid of them, she had to find out what it was. She remembered the card that Officer Moore had given her the day before. Rummaging through her purse, she found it among the rubble of old receipts and Starbucks gift cards. She stared at it for a moment, contemplating on whether or not she should really do what she was thinking of doing. A moment later, she picked up the phone, dialed the number. It rang only twice before the familiar voice answered. "Hello, this is Moore." Frankie paused, unsure of what she should say. "Hello?" Yes, Officer Moore, this is Frankie Welch. We spoke yesterday at Ramona Pruitt's house," she finally said. "Yes, I remember. How can I help you, Miss Welch?" he asked in a bland tone. "Well," she paused for a moment. "I was hoping to get some information on two missing girls. I'm not even sure if you're able to do that or not, but it's really been bothering me," she forced out. There was a brief silence over the phone. "Okay, what girls?" he asked, his tone slightly hinting suspicion. Their names are Heather and Mary Ann Ingram. They went missing in 1998. Another long pause. "Ingram," he repeated. "Yeah, I remember them. They were never found. Not hide nor hair of them. They just disappeared one night," he said, his voice reminiscent. "I actually worked that case. You said it's been bothering you?" "How is that? Do you know them?" he asked. "No, but It bothers me. I can't explain it, but I really need to get to the bottom of it. Can you help me? She said in earnest. Oh, Miss Welch, the case is cold. I can give you all the information I have, but as far as anything goes, you won't likely get any farther on it than we did. No offense, he said with a chuckle. None taken. Why don't you come by the precinct and we'll have a talk about it? It's a lot to go over on the phone. I have a break coming in about an hour. Usually never take them, but in this case I'll make an exception, he said lightheartedly. Thank you, Mr. Moore. I'll be there, Frankie said before exchanging goodbyes and hanging up the phone. What the hell was she doing? She asked herself as she placed the card back in her purse and headed out the door, but not before taking one last look at the now empty corner on the far side of her apartment. I've seen these children before, Mr. Moore, but I can't explain it. I can't explain it to you in a way that you would understand or even believe me, Frankie said, her tone near exasperation. Why can't you explain it to me? I'm here. I'm listening, he replied. His arms crossed over his chest. His expression was one of questioning and concern. She tried to think of some way to tell him, but if he was like everyone else, he would just call her crazy and shoo her away like some irritating fly. Can I just please get the information on those girls? It's really important to me. There's something I have to figure out. He sighed heavily, tipped his chair back, his arms still crossed. I think I deserve some sort of explanation for all of this, Miss Welch. I really do. And until I get something to go on with all of this, I feel no obligation to help you by giving you information on a dead cold case, he said matter-of-factly. Now, you said you've seen Heather and Marion Ingram before. Where did you see them? Frankie hesitated, unsure of what to say or even how to say it. She knew what he would think of her, but she wouldn't get the information she needed without telling him everything. Have you ever worked with psychics in your department, Mr. Moore? She began. Moore's face twitched with question. He sat his chair down on all four legs and leaned forward. A few off and on, why? Well, I have something of a gift, she said, her voice cracking and filled with nervousness. She swallowed hard and looked at him. So you're a psychic, he said. Not quite. I see things, she said. Her hands were beginning to shake now. Moore cocked an eyebrow and looked at her, focusing mainly on her body language and how nervous and agitated she was becoming about the subject. You see things like what? He asked, trying to ease the tension building in her, trying to get her to talk about what it was she was so desperately trying to get off her chest. She lowered her head and tried to focus on keeping her hands still. It's hard to explain. I see things that other people can't see, and I get a lot of grief about it, she said. Okay, so you see things like what, ghosts? He asked gently. She snapped her head up and looked at him with wide eyes. That's That's some of it, but yes, and I have seen those girls in my apartment, the ghosts of those girls. Could you please just give me the information I need without humiliating me anymore, please? She asked. Moore looked at her with an expression mixing sympathy and earnest. He didn't respond right away, but sat there just looking at her like that. He wasn't sure whether he should believe her or follow his first instinct of locking her up in Shady Acres with the rest of the crack-ups in this damn city. He decided to go undecided, but to help her. She wanted information on a cold case, she could have it. It had haunted him for years, and he was done with it. Hell, she could take the whole damn file for all he cared. He stood without saying anything and left the small office they sat in. Not even a look to tell her what it was he was going to do next. He just got up and left. She scanned the room around her. Just what you would expect from a rundown precinct office. Brown, fading paint, a few pictures of family dusted over from years of build-up. An old air conditioner sitting precariously in an open window, blue plastic stringers flying from it as though desperate to escape. The ceiling drooped in one corner from what looked like had been a leak some years back, with a brown-orange stain adorning it with just the right amount of color to lend stability to her theory. The window was cracked just above the bottom of the frame in a crescent shape, like the chair he sat in had been tipped back just a bit too far at one time. The computer sitting on his desk was so out of date she could have used it as a child, and a small handheld television sat askew on the far corner with a bent antenna and a broken power knob. His coffee cup had a handle that had been glued back on, and stains on the inside from years and years of use. It read Super Cop. Kinda cute, she thought. Something a child would give to their father or uncle. The door kicked open after a few minutes, startling her. Moore started in the room with a box in his arms and plopped it down on the desk in front of her. Here it is. All the case files on Heather and Marion Ingram, he said, winded. He stood there with a hand leaning on the corner of his desk, trying to catch his breath. Take it, he finished. Frankie stood and looked at the box before her, then at Officer Moore. I don't know how to thank you for this. It means so much to me, she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. He simply nodded his head and moved to the chair across the desk and sat down. You'll let me know if you need anything, he said. It wasn't a request. It seemed to be a demand. Was he so concerned? I will, and thank you again, she said before picking up the box and looking at Moore for a moment. Why do you believe me when no one else does, Officer Moore? She had to ask. He looked at her, his hands behind his head and his chair tipped back on two legs again. I never said I did, he began, but I wanted an explanation and you gave me one. She took a deep breath inward and sighed, lowering her eyes to the box in her arms. Thank you, Officer Moore, she repeated as she walked out of his office. The case files led her to where the girl's parents had been staying, an old retirement home off of 9 Mile called Sundance Meadows. She was nervous, unsure if she wanted to talk to them or not, but she needed information she wouldn't get out of that little box with all the papers in it. It was a very lax environment. It was a place that seemed to offer a good amount of freedom to the elderly, clean, serene, and comfortable, but with enough nurses and aides roaming about to offer a sense of security that most people that come to a place like this would need. The nurse's desk at the front of the main building was a far cry from the one at Shady Acres Asylum. Very neat, clean, and polite. "Hello, I'm Frankie Welch. I am looking for Heather and Brendan Ingram. Are they here?" she asked lightly. The nurse looked at her and smiled. "Yes, they are. It is so unusual that they have visitors. Normally they just sit here alone looking out the windows and holding hands. They are a sweet old couple, but I think they are really lonely. It's nice of you to come and see them," she said as she took Frankie's name down on a visitor list, came out from behind the desk, and motioned to walk with her. As she did, she noticed the corridors well lit, art lining the walls, and a variety of plants here and there. It was a pleasant scene, not at all like she would picture from a nursing home. "They are pretty quiet normally, but I think maybe they would warm up to you if you just give them some time to get used to you. We try to encourage socializing here, but these two keep pretty much to themselves. I mean, they aren't disruptive or anything, they're quiet. They lost their kids a long time ago, and I don't think they ever really got over it. Twin girls, I think," the chipper nurse said as she walked in front of Frankie. "It's actually really sad how a loss like that can affect you for so long," she continued. "You have a visitor. This is Frankie. She's a very nice lady," she said as she opened the door. Inside sat two well-aged people, maybe mid to late 60s, sitting in front of a window holding hands. "I'll leave you folks to get to know each other," the nurse said as she walked away, leaving the door open. Frankie stepped inside, unsure of how to begin. She took a seat next to Mrs. Ingram and looked quietly for a moment at the couple. Their eyes never moved, staring blankly out the window in front of them as though they were the only two people on earth. Never speaking, unmoving. It was almost eerie seeing it. "My name is Frankie," she began in a quiet tone, almost afraid that she would disturb them. They didn't answer, only stared out the window, fixated on it. "I was hoping maybe you could answer some questions for me." She hesitated a moment. "About your daughters?" Like a shot, their heads turned at once, in strange swift movement as though their heads were trying to work themselves off their shoulders, eyes wide, tearing through her like glass, their expressions ones of concentrated shock, both the same, both pointed at her, their hands still locked together as if they were glued that way. It was an unnatural movement, unnatural expression, and it terrified her. She closed her eyes against it, tight, and told herself it wasn't real, even though she knew it was. A way to delude herself into a small amount of comfort, perhaps. When she opened them again, they sat, as they had before, just staring out the window blankly, without expression, as though she had not said a word to them. "Mrs. Ingram," Frankie said in a low tone. "They're gone." Mr. Ingram said briskly. Frankie was set aback for a moment, unsure that he had spoken. They were taken from us years ago, Mrs. Ingram put in. Neither of them turned their eyes from the windows. They simply stared, even as they spoke, as though they weren't even there. Our home. Mrs. Ingram trailed off then, seeming as though her mind had wandered and lost itself in her own thoughts. Mr. Ingram continued for her then. It was late. All we did was go to check on them, just like we did every night. Every night. Just to make sure they were okay. He recited it like a story, something he had told a million times, and maybe to himself to ease his suffering of the loss. They were gone. Our girls. Just gone. As if they hadn't been there at all. She could see the hurt show in his eyes as he said it, and though his eyes never left the window. Mrs. Ingram shuddered then, clasping her husband's hand tighter, just staring. Frankie wondered only for a moment what it was they were looking at. When she looked herself, she saw only trees and gardens. She wondered if they saw the same. That house, Mrs. Ingram began softly. Our home is evil. Frankie just looked at them. Their loss was great. So great she couldn't even imagine what they must have gone through, or what they must still go through to this day. Did they murder their own children? Likely not. And she had to find out what happened to Heather and Marion, not just for their parents, but for the girls themselves.